Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the 13th audio chat on the Q News Patriot audio channel series. I'm the Q News Patriot. My name is SG Anon. Coming back with you today coming back to you today, I should say, with Dr. Kirk Elliott. For those of you who have joined us before, you're well aware of his sort of no nonsense, very to the point description of the things that are going on in the financial world. Many of you out there are also aware that he is, a man of faith and someone who is fulfilling, I think, his calling in this particular awakening process that we're all in, and we all have to sort of fill that niche and find that conduit and that channel that suits us best. And for those of you who are new to it, I'm hoping very much that you'll enjoy our conversation today. We're going to talk a lot about what's going on economically around the rest of the world and how that really comes back to roost with the U.S. Federal Reserve central bank system, right? Remember, as we talk about these things on this program and other shows like that, we have to sort of bridge the consciousness gap between those who are wide awake, very well aware of the things that have been going on for a long time, and others who are just sort of coming around to the fold, just realizing that the Federal Reserve isn't federal, right? They're federal like FedEx is. Just maybe realizing for the first time that just because someone says your money's worth something, if they can't prove that it's worth something, if there's not some sort of standard by which you draw the value pertaining to that or any other resource that you exchange, then how good is it really? And so these are the conversations that we have to have, and we have to have them in the open, and we have to position them, I think, and tailor them in a fashion that it's not offensive to the intellectual out there, the first time patriot who's coming around to the fold and trying to understand that maybe the things I learned or the things that I taught or experienced aren't really all of the pie, and maybe it wasn't a full and complete conclusion. So, with that being said, Dr. Kirk, thank you for coming back. I appreciate you being here.
It's my pleasure to be with you again, SG.
So, as we look at what's going on in the world, we just had this BRIC summit in August, towards the end of August, I believe 24 through 26 or 23 through 26, held in Durban, South Africa, a very large metro area, the largest port in the country, known colloquially by the Portuguese who first discovered this area back in the 19th century. That this was sort of Christmas country, right? They called it I forget the exact term, but it was Feliz de Mar or something like that. It was the terminology in Portuguese comes back to Christmas country. We've witnessed Russia out and out say what everybody has known is coming for a while, right? We've watched the actions. I think you can really read the directionality of geopolitical events that are happening around the world by looking at the actions that nation states take. Typically, the action is taken first, and then the rhetoric comes later. And what we've seen now from Russia is an official admission that we are spearheading the de-dollarization of the world and that it cannot be stopped. The Russian Federation is essentially pivotal, I think, and maybe the Chinese as well in regards to fuel and military protection. But certainly the Russian Federation is pivotal in the transition from the African continent and all of the resources, wealth, and riches that lie within that continent that have been so lambasted and so pillaged for so long by the United States central bank dollar system. And that disconnection is really going to harm, I think, the United States status around the world, even more so than it already has been, right? We're witnessing nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE now officially within the BRICS bloc. I think that makes 6 of the 9 major oil producing nations that have now transitioned away from the US dollar. We have a number of nations that are, sort of lesser nations militarily and maybe not with the same amount of clout, economic clout that the United States markets and the United States armed forces could bring to bear. But a lot of those nations very wealthy in resources, and they also are looking to the BRICS nations or essentially anything that's not having to do with the US dollar as they break away. At the same time that this is occurring in the business and financial space, we have actual active military coups that are spawning off all along Central and Western Africa that are dethroning the central bank governments that have been friendly to Washington and friendly to London for a very long time. We're witnessing sort of the neo-colonial movement being thrown out of the African continent. I think this all ties back together to the liberation of a very large component of the Earth's riches and resources. What say you?
I'd say you're spot on. I mean, really, but when I look at it, I look at it with a kind of a different lens too. Like when people are speaking, there's body language, right? But when Putin was speaking at this event, via video, because he wasn't allowed into South Africa because of war crimes or something like that, right? So he's speaking, but he's coming at it, and correct me if I'm wrong, from a very smug, arrogant, type of a posture. Now, he's a narcissist to begin with, right? So he's always got that air, but it's different. It's almost like speaking when I know something that's going to happen that you don't know. That kind of confidence, right? Where when we contrast that with like when Biden speaks, if it's coherent, right? But it's like it's very weak in posture, because when human nature, when you're speaking lies, you know, there you don't have that same confidence. For example, our GDP is growing, our unemployment rate is down, the economy is strong, right? It's like, well, none of that's actually true, right? So therefore, there's not going to be the confidence behind the statement, and you can feel it and you can sense it. Where when Putin was speaking, you know, he went through this transition on the first night of the BRICS meeting, where he first said, you know, reemphasizing what you said, the dollar is receding globally in its global centrality. It's an objective and irreversible process. So what does that mean? It means the BRICS nations' objective is to de-dollarize the world, and this is irreversible. It's not going to change. Well, so after he goes on for that for a little bit, he turns into an angry cheerleader, for lack of a better explanation, right? And what did he say, right? I mean, he said, and you have to remember who the audience is, right? He's got the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but he's also got 20 other heads of state there that have already petitioned to be part of the BRICS members nations, and 60 heads of state that are kicking the tires. Kind of, is this really the team that we want to be part of, right? They want to be part of a winning team. They're checking it out. So there's a lot of powerful heads of state there, right, that are listening. So what does he say? He took a swipe at the U.S. and the West, like you said, London and New York. And he said, there's illegitimate sanctions, seriously weigh on the international economic situation, and there's unlawful freezing of sovereign states' assets, right? He's trying to scare the listening audience into thinking the West is evil. They have the ability and the power and the control to freeze our assets through their banking system. Therefore, join ours, right? It's going to be better, right? That's what he's saying. Well, how can he say that? Well, even before the BRICS meetings, the BRICS nations that make up that is 31% of the global economy, of global GDP. Compared that to the G7 nations, you know, the Western powers, 30%. So they already have an advantage in economic power with this global kind of union that they have. Well, then what did they do? So they've got this posture of strength. They've already got the GDP might, the economic output, but there's still a big problem if they're trying to be the world's reserve currency, and that is the US dollar, because we still are, right? Or were. So that's the transition, because on the last day of that meeting, they added the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, two massive oil producing nations. And then come January 1st, they're adding Egypt, Ethiopia, Argentina. You know, who is the other one that they're adding? Egypt, Ethiopia, Argentina, and Iran, right? So that makes 6 of the 9 largest oil producers. What, for all intents and purposes, what they just did is dismantled the petrodollar status, right? Because now they can trade back and forth. So
incredible.
When we went into this BRICS meeting for probably 3 months prior, everybody thought, and for a while I was included in that they're going to have they're going to announce a BRICS common currency backed by gold, right? Their central bank digital currency. And that was re-amplified on July 7th when the Russian embassy, through the Russian Times news outlet, said, well, you can't really reinterpret this any other way. We're excited about the BRICS common currency that's going to be backed by gold. It's like, okay, no room for speculation on that. They're excited about it, right? But then 2 weeks prior to this meeting, Putin did an about face, right? So he said, we're not quite, this is a paraphrase, we're not quite ready for a BRICS common currency. Therefore, my objective is, and my plan is, we just trade back and forth with each other's currencies in this BRICS common union and not the US dollar, right? So what did he just do? I mean, this was a very tactical move. in its objective and scope and reach and everything, right? So when you add up all of the population of the countries in the BRICS nations and add to that the ones that they're adding, we're pushing almost 70% of the world's population. I mean, just India and China is a big chunk, right? But so 70%. So that's a big trading block. Imagine all of those countries trading back and forth in their own currencies, which does two things. It boosts their currency and it diminishes the US dollar, right? So like Putin speaking with this double-edged sword sticking out of his mouth, raising the value of their currencies, diminishing the US dollar. And when you look at it economically, a gold-backed BRICS common currency would have been the slow death of the US dollar, right? It would have just been, over time, it would have attracted more demand of other countries moving into that system because, hey, it's a central bank digital currency and it's backed by gold. It's better than other ones, right? So the slow death of the dollar. What Putin just did was actually kind of almost the immediate death of the US dollar, because he just removed the reserve currency status and the petrodollar status that's been around since 1944 and the Bretton Woods Act that gave us the lifestyle that we have in this country. You know, built-in demand for our currency allowed us to amass $32 trillion worth of federal debt. And that's what China wants. That's what the BRICS nations wants. They want what we had, right? That lifestyle, that power, that impact and influence. And so by doing what they did, they're getting it done really quickly. So what does that mean moving forward? I mean, this is the transitional part of the global economy that during that meeting, I was watching and just looking, surfing the news on CNN, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, Fox News, BBC. Nobody was talking about the BRICS meeting. Nobody, right? And
I can't imagine why.
Yeah, and they were more concerned about Trump's mugshot, which I'm not concerned about the mugshot. I'm concerned about the lies and the fallacies of why he had to get the mugshot, right? But so all and Taylor Swift's, concert tickets being, just people getting incorrect ones and they're plagiarized, they're counterfeited, right? It's like, oh my word, everyone's concerned about things that don't really matter, yet this is the big pendulum shifting moment, the paradigm shift in the global economy, and the BRICS nations just kind of won, right? So what does that mean? It means when we don't have built-in demand for our currency, we're going to have to print our way out of it, which is interesting because right after the BRICS nations, the Fed met in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And here's Powell, chairman of the Fed, speaking the most milquetoast, down the middle of the road, medium comments ever, right? They're not hawkish, they're not dovish, they're just, well, we're winning the war on inflation, but we're keeping the door open to raise rates more just in case we haven't. It's like, okay, what? He just said a mouthful of nothing, right? He might as well have not even spoke, right? So then it gets a little bit squirrelier when Christine Lagarde, head of the European Central Bank, right after that says something very not peculiar, but ominous for them, because they stated the fact that we've never seen anything like the inflationary pressures that we're seeing globally. And we don't know if the interest rate hikes that we've done are going to be adequate to fix it because we've never seen anything like this before. Therefore, my interpretation, we don't know what we're doing and we don't know how we're going to fix it, right? So all of this is building into people's hearts and minds of the Western financial system. It might be over, which is going to have a dramatic impact on the stock market, on the bond market, on everything. And it's going to give rise to this void. There's now a void of power economically in the BRICS nations. They're filling it, right? So when you look at it from that lens, and people are, SG, people are looking at the wrong thing. To see where America and the dollar is headed, all you have to do is look at one thing, the bond market, right? It's like, okay, why the bond market, right? What does that have to do with anything, right? So well, it has everything to do with everything, right? So when you look at
Let me
I want
stop
to
you
fill
really
in.
quick because I want to make sure that I understand, because this is actually
Yeah.
a question I have as well on my end. When we talk about the bond market, first of all, we're referring to U.S. Treasury bonds, correct?
Yep. Yep.
And the bond
US
market is the most accurate real-time representation of an economy's health. Is that correct?
That's correct. So, because if you think about treasury bonds, the US Treasury, for example, it's supposed to be the blue chip of all bonds, the safest investment in the world for conservative investors, right? It's the United States. We're big, we're huge, we have manufacturing, we have a strong economy. And when push comes to shove, even if we get in trouble, we're just going to raise the debt ceiling and print more money. So therefore the bonds shouldn't default, right? So throughout time, the U.S. Treasury has been considered like a risk-free asset, which is a stupid term, right? Because nothing is risk-free in this world. But it's been considered that, which means it has a very low interest rate, because investors, when you invest and you want a high return, you generally have to settle for high risk. And if you want low risk, you're going to settle for a low return, right? So compare that to like a junk bond, for example, the Michael Milken days, just selling, hey, everybody, we've got a deal for you, right? Where there's this company, we don't know if it's going to be around 9 months from now. They're really in financial trouble, but they need to raise some capital. But because of the risk, we're going to pay you 15% interest rate, right? So that's a junk bond. Compared that to the US Treasury. Now, we've got rising GDP, according to the Atlanta Fed, who measures GDP. So all the Federal Reserve banks, the regional ones, focus on a different thing. Like St. Louis Fed focuses on inflation. The Atlanta one focuses on gross domestic product. So they can have their economic experts there. So their GDP now estimate says that there was 5.9% growth in real GDP in the third quarter. Well, this is a possibly true, but possibly not, right? But the problem is not that. The problem is, unofficially, inflation is 15 to 20%. So when gross domestic product measures what? Everything that we buy or sell at retail prices that are produced by our country, right? That's what GDP basically measures. So if inflation's at 15 to 20%, then GDP, which is a measure of everything that we're buying, should be at 15 to 20%. It's not. It's at 5.9%, even on their possibly cooked books numbers, right? So that means the economy is in contraction. So the economy is in contraction. We've got this inflation, and that's the kiss of death. It's like the slow death trap, because I'm not saying that the economists at the Fed or the Treasury Department are stupid. They're smart PhDs, right? But their messaging is just a lie. It's just wrong, because they believe that debt-driven growth is actually growth. It's not. All the growth we're seeing in the U.S. economy is because of stimulus money right now. So debt-driven, it's not growth. It's actually shrinkage. Only people spending money for real is real growth, right? So debt-driven growth, debt-based growth is an oxymoron kind of a statement. Well, who believes oxymoron statements? Morons, right? And they're the ones that actually are making these statements, right? So let me put it into a story format for all the listeners, right? So it's kind of like a tale of the drunk and the stupid. There was a guy, it's not my term, a guy named Matthew Piepenberg from goldswitzerland.com actually made up that term, and I loved it. I just think it's hilarious. But here's the story of the tale of the drunk and the stupid. So let's say, SG, that you're a frat boy. You go to college, you're living in this fraternity, and you've got all these other frat boys that are living in the frat house. And what do they have? They have their dad's credit card, right? And so what's the first thing that all these frat boys do when they get their dad's credit cards? All these drunk undergraduates, right? Well, they build a bar in the frat house, and then they stock the bar with a bunch of top shelf liquor. And then they say, oh, we're going to have parties here all the time. We better put a big, huge, massive TV screen in the living room. We're going to have a big, huge party couch there, and it's going to be fun, right? So what happens? That when they live this lifestyle, their grades start coming down from A to B to C to D to F, right? And the dad calls and says, son, we're cutting you off from your credit card. It's like you're squandering all this time and you're not doing what you're supposed to do. And so therefore I'm cutting you off. See, view now Washington, D.C. as the political version of a frat house, right? So they've got dad's credit card, meaning they have a printing press. They're just printing all this money to fund every stimulus under the sun, doing all this stuff. Well, now we've got this huge debt problem, and their grade is going down from an A to a B to a C because Fitch's, the bond rating agency, downgraded U.S. Treasuries because why would you downgrade a U.S. Treasury? This is what they do, right? And so the reason that a bond gets a grade, a high grade, is because they look at the level of their debt and they look at the income coming in and they say, do we have a propensity to pay this debt off? If so, we're going to get a good grade. So they just got downgraded, right? We're the world's reserve currency that just got downgraded. We don't even have the highest credit score in the world anymore. How could we keep the world reserve currency? See, this to me is the death knell. When you look at the bond market and you have higher yields with all of this debt, right? That's the kiss of death, right? And it can't be sustained. And that's exactly where we are right now. And what Putin and Xi did in China by taking away the petrodollar status, they just accelerated that because now we're going to be forced to print more money because there's no capital inflow coming in. And what do policymakers do to slow down inflation? They raise interest rates. So I'm seeing more inflationary pressures, higher interest rates to slow it down. And that's the beginning of a vicious, vicious cycle that a lot of times in most countries that don't have a reserve currency status and they have to have discretion in their printing and their spending ultimately end up with the same fate. And that goes into hyperinflation, massive inflation, like we've seen in Venezuela, Argentina, Cyprus, Greece, Zimbabwe, Weimar Republic, Germany. The list goes on and on and on. And we're now no different than any of those countries.
That's really astounding. And to keep with the analogy, what you just said a moment ago about dad's credit card, the analogous action to cutting the credit card off is to dump the treasury bonds, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. So China just dumped $100 billion worth of U.S. Treasury bonds, like just recently. They're getting rid of them. They're trying to actually really stick it to the West and saying, look, there's no demand for your stuff. The only people actually buying U.S. Treasuries right now, SG, is the Fed. Well, where does the Fed get the money to buy U.S. Treasuries? They print it out of thin air. It's not real, right? So the Fed's balance sheet is full of toxic assets that nobody else wants, and they keep printing money to buy it, which causes our inflation. This is the end of the banking cycle and the end of the U.S. economy living in the sunlight. We're now in the twilight, right? And we've been overcome, so to speak, by the BRICS nations, which are actually winning this economic war.
This is just amazing. You and I, we launched these talks a while ago, 4 or 5 months ago, and we started talking then about how if you had a worldwide movement that had a number of different objectives, and one of those objectives was to shrink or destroy the Western central banking system model, that we would have to approach times like this. And we were saying that on air as early as, I believe, April and May of this year. And now here we are witnessing in process, and it's not even a secret anymore. Russia comes out and says, no, this is exactly what we're doing. It's judge us by our actions, but you're right. This is exactly what we're doing. All of the oil producing nations, they can't wait to get away from the US dollar and the system of control that it has, sort of yoked themselves to, where they don't have autonomy within their own nations a lot of times. Now, I'm not sitting here endorsing any sort of warlordship style government or theocracies or things like this, but I am saying that to deny someone their autonomy simply as a condition of doing business and then forcing them to do business is itself inherently wrong. So as we look at this process going forward, what we're really going to see, I think, here in the Western world, certainly in the European central bank model, the collapse of the EU economically, I think we see a Soviet Union style collapse of that trading bloc where everyone is forced to go back on sort of their provincial state-based reliabilities and dependabilities and, fail safes, if you will, that they may have. And I'm also looking at this and thinking to myself that maybe not as dramatic overnight, all in one go as a 1929 style crash, but certainly a shrinkage of the stock market space because it's inherently tied to this Western central banking model that, as you pointed out, 70+% of the world's population is simply just saying no to at this point along the way. What does it look like, Dr. Kirk, over the next 90 to 120 days here in the United States and in Western Europe?
So that kind of a short time span is always hard to gauge. It's easier to gauge the medium and long-term effects, which is actually absolute destruction of the dollar. I mean, that's going to be the end game, right? But over the next, I would say 90 days, I think we start to see, and I don't have a perfectly clear crystal ball, nobody does, right? But a stock market starting to go into free fall mode. And historically, you get a big correction every single October, right? It's called the October surprise. So they might as well not even call it the October surprise if it happens every October. Just call it October, right? Where the stock market comes down. But why does it come down, right? So we have to start asking these questions. Well, the end of the fiscal year for the U.S. government's in September, right? So everyone starts to see the numbers. It's like, man, look at all of our expenses. You know, we're just going to have another $2 trillion deficit year, right? Which pushes our national debt from 32 trillion to 34 trillion just without any other stimulus hit. And that's just our budget, right? So you look at that and people say, I don't feel really good about the economy moving forward. I don't know if I want to invest for my retirement, because if there's not going to be people buying iPhones and everything else, right? It's like, why should I invest, right? So that's why every October you get a huge hit on the market. So you're going to see that. You're going to see interest rates. They're going to have all kinds of conversations about, let's raise it another quarter of a point, and then we can pause for a while because we're winning the war on inflation, and then they'll have to keep raising. The reason why I know that we're not going into a permanent pause on interest rates or even coming down is because of what just happened with the BRICS nations. We are going to be forced to print money like there's no tomorrow to help fund the couple $2 trillion deficit that we're going to have for the next fiscal year, to fund the stimulus, to raise the debt ceiling, to fund every single entitlement, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, women, infant, children programs, everything else, right? There's no money coming in anymore to fund that. So therefore, we're going to have to print. This is simply economics 101, because what are the alternatives? So the alternatives are, you go into austerity measures like they did in France, and they had riots and protests and looting, and cops were knocking down 70 and 80-year-old people in the streets that were saying, we're socialists and we live in a socialist country, which means we paid high taxes our whole lives for the country to take care of our retirement. And then the France ran out of money. And they said, we're going to raise your retirement age by a few years, right? And then what comes next? No, not only are we going to raise your retirement age, we're going to decrease your benefits. These are austerity measures. That happened in Cyprus and Greece, right? Happens in every country that runs out of money. Well, that's the beginning of mayhem, right? Because and I know you're a student of history, I am too, I love it, right? But every single time throughout history, when you've had an economic collapse, it's always followed by social chaos, always, right? And so we saw that in France. We see that in Venezuela. We saw that in Argentina. We saw that everywhere, right? And we're starting to see it now in America. I just read an article yesterday, actually, that Giant Foods, it's a large grocery store chain in the Mid-Atlantic area, like DC, right? So in DC, they're taking all the name brand stuff off the shelves. There's pictures of like where the Tide would be or the Clorox, right? The name brands. And because people are stealing it all, right? They're just shoplifting it. So they're going to replace it with store brand stuff that's not as attractive, in hopes that, you know what, let's hope that people don't want the store brand stuff as much as they want this, or else we're going to have to go out of business. So only after those kind of crises, when this is the weird societal shift that you start to see, is this moral order of things starts to play itself out, where it's unethical, it's immoral to steal, but is it ethical and moral to steal if it means this is feeding our family, right? So you, even unethical, immoral things have kind of this higher moral pecking order than letting your family starve, right? So this is how you start to get social disarray, social chaos, and instability. And you look at every big city around America, you've got real estate in decline, or massive decline. The occurrence of violent crime, robberies, burglaries, shootings, stabbings, muggings, it's up everywhere. So we're starting to see now the economic problems turn into social problems. And when social problems become great enough, people start to give away all of their freedoms in exchange for perceived security and peace. And this is where I think this is headed, is people across the country are going to say, sure, we'll take central bank digital currency, even though it means complete loss of freedom, complete loss of privacy, the ability for the government to cut us off from buying or selling if they don't like what we're spending our money on, right? I mean, none of that sounds attractive to me, but yet people will give up their freedoms if it comes with, hey, how about you take our central bank digital currency, and you know what we're going to give you with that? Universal basic income. How does that sound, right? And so there's always this shiny thing, this carrot out there to entice people into something that they shouldn't have. And this is where I see America kind of headed. Now,
the gift cards for the COVID vaccines.
Yeah, absolutely. And now COVID 2.0 is coming, right? And they've already announced it. And they already announced that some of the pharmaceutical companies have a vaccine that's going to be kind of an all-inclusive vaccine that covers all kinds of things. It's like, wait a second, it's not even here yet. So how can you have a vaccine for something that you don't even know what it's going to be? Weird question, right? Except they do know what it's going to be, right? But here's the problem that I see why I talked about social collapse is during COVID-1, mom and pop businesses, small business owners, they spent their wallet. They spent their life savings just to get through because nobody was out shopping. Nobody was buying anything. Restaurants were shut down. So some of them made it through, right? Now, if COVID 2.0 comes around and they force shutdowns, mask mandates, travel restrictions, these small business owners in America, they use flying. They're not going to have anything left, right? And this is the problem moving forward, and why I think the social collapse is going to be much worse this time around. But I believe this is all manufactured chaos. When you have bank failures, economic failures, loss of the reserve currency status, health crisis. I mean, the United Nations in their Pact for the Future laid all of this out about 3 months ago. And they said they can have unlimited emergency powers if there's a global health crisis, if there's a global financial crisis, if there's a black swan event, right? So what do those unlimited emergency powers do? They can cut you off from buying or selling or traveling or mandates on you. They can do whatever they want. And you know what? We gave it to them. We gave them the power to do that. Our president gave up the sovereign authority as president to the World Health Organization, not even an elected official, just somebody with a job in Brussels, right? To say, okay, we can decide the fate of well over 190 countries around the globe, right? And this is kind of where we're headed, is this weird. I know your question was a short one and I gave you a really long answer, but over the next 90 days or so, we start moving in that direction. We're entering into flu season as well. Well, by the end of that, what are we in? We're in election season, right? So I think that this goes on. It starts to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And now you've got, sniffings of Adam Schiff in California, the congressperson saying, under Section 3, Article 14 of the Constitution, insurrection laws, we're not going to allow Trump to be on any of the state ballots, right? So this is probably going to go to the Supreme Court. Imagine the social, if the huge front runner of the GOP not being allowed to run. And then Adam Schiff was bragging about it. And he said, the way that I see it, the Constitution doesn't say that you actually have to be convicted of insurrection. It just means that you have to be part of something, right? And so this is the angle that they're taking. And the reason I bring all of that up is political, economic, social consequences to everything that's happening are going to ultimately end up in a loss of our freedoms, right? So, but don't be fearful. Don't be of dismay by the things that SG, you and I are talking about, right? Everyone that's listening, because there's going to be a groundswell of grassroots support in good things, right? We're already seeing Texas, for example. They missed the legislative deadline, and I'm sad by it, right? But what were they wanting to do? A state chartered central bank backed by gold, right? To get out of the Fed system, away from FedNow app, away from the FDIC, away from the Federal Reserve. Alaska's wanting to do the same thing. You've got DeSantis in Florida that said, we're not going to take central bank digital currency in our state. It's an ultimate loss of freedom. Now, he didn't go as far as to say what the solution was going to be. He just said, we're not taking it. But now already you've got 7 states, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Utah, Wyoming, there's others I can't remember off the top of my head that have passed legislation that make gold legal tender in those states. What's the common denominator? Central state-run chartered central bank backed by gold. Gold is legal tender. You've also got central banks around the world that don't listen to what they say. Watch what they do would be my encouragement, because they might be saying that their central bank digital currency thing is the greatest thing since sliced bread, but what are they doing? They're buying gold, not by the ounce or by the pound or by the ton, but by the hundreds or thousands of tons. China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkey, literally gold by the hundreds or thousands of tons. To what end? They know there's a currency shift coming. And part of me thinks, all right, they're going to back their central bank digital currency with gold to attract everybody into the system, or they realize there's a lot of opposition to this movement. It might not succeed. So therefore, we still want to be the world's reserve currency. Let's back our currency with gold, right? I don't know what the end result there is going to be, other
Sort of
than
being
I can
forced
look
into
at
a
what they're
corner.
doing and draw some parallels.
Sort of like being forced into a corner.
Yeah, absolutely forced into a corner.
You know, what's so amazing about this period of time is that we get to live it and we get to watch the defanging of a very, very evil power structure concentrated in the control of a select few within the central banking system. You know, you and I have had conversations off air at different times about the Rothschilds, for example, or the Bilderberg Group, or other very influential dynasties, right, throughout the last couple of 100 years, and their control of money, finance, and power. And we're witnessing that system sort of being forced into its own implosion, but not without that same sort of existential survival level resistance that you would have, right? Anytime that you go to take the life of another being, another entity, another organism, it's going to fight tooth, nail, and hammer all of the way to the end, because that is the end, right? That's an irrevocable, irreversible process, right? Just like Putin said, this is an irreversible death of the dollar. So let me ask you, a lot of people, you know, are aware throughout this time of needing to be prepared. Most folks out there are preparing with things like food and water, which I think are very important to have on hand. Alternative abilities to supply for fuel, for example. Your specialty is helping people connect with precious metals that are, by and large, pretty affordable by comparison, right? We talked a little bit about gold earlier, but I almost think of you sometimes in my musings as the silver guy. And it, you know, it fits the color of the beard, you know, very well.
Thanks. You
So
just aged me. Yeah.
So I look at that and I think to myself, well, what options are available to the people out there that are going through this process in time, right? Purchasing a little bit of extra canned food if you're able to afford that in your budget. Finding a way to put back a little bit of potable water, even if it's just for a period of a few weeks or months. You know, finding something that has barterable value, like silver bullion. You and I have talked a number of times about things like 1 ounce rounds. Where does precious metals, as it pertains to the being emergency prepared to go through things like this, where does that fall, right? And let me frame the question a little bit better. When we went through the crash of 29, that was an architected event that these individuals orchestrated and pulled off themselves, right? They forced the collapse of their own system. A lot of those major financial names, families, and companies took very, very large options for shorts against the markets, right? And so they actually made an absolute killing with the crash of the U.S. market here in the United States, the Depression of 29, and then the ensuing Great Depression that came after that. while the vast majority of people who were sandbagged by the events of the time and blindsided by what was occurring, really sort of left to their own devices. And if you were able to put food in your mouth, you were doing really good. So the precious metals, as the reason I bring that up is a lot of those individuals, a lot of those families, a lot of those very wealthy, elite, evil jerks, really is what we could call them, that did those events and pulled those events on purpose. They were extremely, enormously divested into tangible things that had real value. You've used the term several times on this program that a carton of eggs has never cost you nothing, because it's a real item. It's a real commodity. It has a real tradable exchange. There's a real desire for it. And there's a belief basis that some sort of value should be exchanged in order to, move this commodity from one individual party or entity to another. How does precious metals tie into the events that we're going through right now? And what can we expect? I guess I should say, if we look at the historical lens.
Well, the historical lens, you've got two things that we're looking at. Number one is tangible assets that never go to zero, right? It's got this downside protection. And our goal as investors is to minimize risk and maximize return. Well, companies can go to zero overnight. They just go bankrupt, right? So things never go to zero. So you've got protection. You've seen growth, right? You've seen March of 2020, silver was $11.91 an ounce. 10 months ago, it was, like August of last year, maybe 11 months ago, it was about 17.97. Today, it's over 23. I mean, that trend is going up at a tune of over 30% a year growth. It's a great investment, right? But what we're talking about is, in addition to that, protection of our freedoms, protection of our way of life, right? Because you can use silver for barter, right? Like a 1 ounce silver round, you could have in your pocket. You could trade it back and forth to merchants if the currency collapses, nobody wants it anymore. Or if you've got evangelicals and Catholics all over the world that say, what, the central bank digital currency is the mark of the beast, we're not taking it. And you've got libertarians that say, ultimate loss of freedom, spyware on our bank accounts, no way are we playing, right? No matter what people group you look at, central bank digital currency is complete loss of freedom. This buys you your freedom, right? Because it's a tangible asset that you take delivery of. So it's not digital. You're not somebody's digital slave in their digital world. It's not a piece of paper that can burn up overnight, right? It's a thing. And the farther down this road that we get with the Bank for International Settlements wanting to open up a unified ledger, is what they call it in their official documents, which is a tokenized, in the central bank digital currency world, blockchain world. Tokenization means collecting of all your data and packing it up into a process. Now, like Bitcoin is private. It's decentralized. Centralized is the opposite. They know the source of funds, use of funds. They know the ownership. It's programmable. It's immutable, not immutable. So, which means they can change ownership on a whim. Gold and silver are outside of that. Unlike real estate can be tokenized. Why? Because even when you own it free and clear in America, you don't really own it. Try not paying your property taxes. What happens, right? They can sell it in a tax lien. It has a title to it. It's not completely private. So gold and silver are completely private when you purchase it, which means it's getting out of the system, which to me, you add both of those together, you've got a great investment, protection of your freedoms and your privacy moving forward. It's just the best thing to do right now. Now, I love gold too, but I'm not going into gold right now because silver is outperforming. At some point, I think silver triples the rate of growth of gold over the next 12 to 18 months. We'll sell our silver, lock in those profits, roll them into gold. What did I just do? I got you 3 times as many ounces of gold then as what I could have purchased for you today. That's amazing. But you can't do that with semi-numismatic rare coins, collectible stuff. You can only do that with bullion that has low premium. And that's what we help people get into, to maximize their ounces, minimize their cost, and get into something that you don't have to make a market for, right? A lot of the stuff that you see on TV, let the buyer beware, right? The only way that there's a market for them is if you have a sales crew calling saying, hey, have I got a deal for you? We just got this inventory and it's going to be gone in 72 hours. I'll give you 5% off if you buy it today, right? What bullion is a globally traded commodity used for manufacturing. It's a 45-second phone call. You lock in the price, you wire you the funds, you have it, right? There's a time and a place for everything. not all gold and silver created equal, not all dealers are created equal, right? It's like, but this is what we help strategically put together portfolios for clients that will stand the test of time, as a great investment, but also because of my own philosophy and yours too, we want to protect our freedoms, which is why you talked about, food, things that you would need to survive, but we don't have to ever let the word survive enter our vocabulary. We can thrive, right? And during these time frames that we're living in, you just have to act and do the right thing.
I appreciate that summary very much because we're, I think, entering into those times now where our metal is going to be tested generationally. This is a generational battle that we're all moving through and that we're living here in this world. There's a lot of rightings of wrongs that are, I think, occurring in some ways. And I think in some regards, we could even say that necessary wrongs are being committed or permitted to achieve greater aims and greater ends, right? And that's sort of a nebulous, difficult place to pass judgment on. But taking the steps that we can take from where we're at, I think, is the most important component of and taking our knowledge, right, our awareness of discussions like this and actually putting it to good use in an actionable way that's going to help us and preserve us moving forward, right? If we'd had the ability, say in 1927 and 1928, to have discussions like this in the same format digitally where we could connect with the rest of the world, right, in a fairly instantaneous fashion, what would 1929 have really looked like? What would people have actually, achieved or not achieved or been subjected to in those processes had they had some sort of advance notice? And I will say, just for the audience members out there, that I've worked really hard to try and find individuals that I can bring onto the platform, QNP and other places like that, where the ordinary everyday person has options and can be a part of this, right? I've had people email me saying that they've done business with you, Dr. Kirk, for as little as $100 to $125. They're very pleased with it. I have other people that have rolled over, different life savings accounts and things like that, and they talk about how gracious your staff has been and how clear and precise you all have been as you discuss things. And so I just want to say thank you for that. I appreciate you taking care of my audience. I value my audience a lot. I love everybody out there that watches programs like this and others, because in the end of the day, the love component of this, which I think brings us back to the spiritual component of this battle, right, is the most important part. These people that have owned these central banks and have leveraged their control of the financial sector to cause such suffering for so long, they hate us because we have the ability to love endlessly, even as we go right through the fire, and to smile and laugh in their face and point our fingers at them while we do it. So I guess I'm going to close with that. But at first I'd like to ask, where can people find you? Where can they go if they have questions or if they want to learn more? Where would they go?
Two different ways to make it really easy. Just give us a call, 720-605-3900, and just say that SG sent you. Or you can go to our website, ends up same result. You just fill out your information and we'll give you a call to set up an appointment with one of our advisors, right? And that's KirkElliottPhD.com. That's 2 L's and 2 D's. So KirkElliottPhD.com/SG.
Wonderful. And so I guess I'm going to leave the last closing thoughts to you, my friend, when we talk about coming back to the fullness of who humanity is. And you and I have had this conversation on a philosophical level off air a couple of times. We have to reorient how we view the exchange of value and how we view the economic process, how we control it, how it interacts with us, where the actual holding of real value versus nebulous value, we could call it that, where that actually intersects with us. So as we move forward through this process, what do you see as humanity sort of coming together in a unified way around this idea of finance and value exchange?
Well, I think there's been so much overreach from the international non-governmental organizations, the UN, the World Economic Forum, Bank for International Settlements, along with the Fed and the banking crisis that we're seeing, that people are going to say, and like states are already starting to say, is, wow, this is way too much. This is more than what we thought. And there's going to be alternative systems that actually establish themselves almost overnight, right? Whether it's using silver for barter, state chartered banks, quantum financial system. We don't know how it's going to look, but what I do know is that they will always manifest themselves at the right time. One thing that we know about God is that he's never going to let us down. He's never early and he's never late. He's always just on time, right? And so, we have to take this leap of faith always to get into the right place at the right time, and he'll provide a way. He's providing a way for us. And I really think that tangible assets in a world of digital overreach and complete control of people and who you give to, what church you give to, what you spend your money on, how you live, where you travel. I mean, everything. People are going to ultimately see this as like, this is not what we thought it was going to be, right? And
Absolutely.
that's where we're headed. That's where we're headed. And this is why every single time we're on the air, I shout it from the rooftops, just act, because there's a solution, there's an answer for us to be in the right place at the right time.
You know, it's amazing, my friend, and I look forward to coming back with you again as we go through this process and this journey. I think we're in for a very fascinating end of Q3 and beginning of Q4. And I think, honestly, as we go through these weeks and months ahead, you know, President Trump has said this a number of times. This is a final battle. This is the most important election in the history of America. There's never been a situation like this. There's never been a movement like this. The United States, economically, militarily, has never been so vulnerable. And so as we go through this process, I think that we can expect a very interesting and, I think in some regards, maybe a challenging road ahead. And I look forward to having you back on the show.
I look forward to it too. I can't wait.
So everyone, I hope that has helped answer some of your questions today. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon on this 13th audio chat. This is SG Anon, and I'll be back with each of you again soon on the Q News Patriot. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.